Hey everyone, welcome to part 3 of a series we've entitled Bad Blood. We're looking at relationships that maybe have had some sort of tension in them or something happened that's caused them to have a little bit of, bad blood in the relationship. We've navigated a number of different lenses that help us to understand how to make these relationships really good. And today, I want to give you one lens that will help you, especially when that bad blood relationship actually becomes so toxic that you just want to get out of it. So by the end of this video, I'll give you that lens. But before we get to that, we need to take a look at the 2 lenses that we've looked at so far that actually lead us up to this 3rd lens. So let's take a look. So when you're navigating a bad blood relationship, the first lens that we said is really important to take a look at to help maybe get that relationship restored and back in good health is you need to look at the relationship through the lens of possibility. What's possible in that relationship? And not just asking, what do you think is possible? But an even bigger and maybe even a better question is, what does God think is possible in that relationship? That's the first lens, the lens of possibility that will help you to look at that bad blood relationship and perhaps see it in a way that could be restored and brought to life again. Now, once you've discovered not just what you think is possible, but more importantly, what God thinks is possible for that relationship, the next lens that we encourage you to take a look at that relationship through is the empathy lens. That's taking the long walk around to the other side and looking at that relationship, not from your point of view, but from the other person's point of view. I know so many times for me, I see things from a certain perspective, but when I look at it from the other person's perspective, I see a whole different picture. That is so important when it comes to bad blood relationships because their perspective is their truth, and it's important for me to understand what they see. Now, if you've looked at your bad blood relationship through the lens of possibility and the empathy lens, you may still find yourself in a relationship where you've had conversations with that person, seeing it from their side, seeing it from what God thinks is possible, and you still find yourself in a relationship that has bad blood. What do you do then? When the relationship is still tense, or maybe if it's even been toxic and hurtful for you, what do you do when that's the situation? This 3rd lens that I'm about to share with you is the lens that will help you when that bad blood relationship moves from just being tense to actually being toxic and harmful to you. So, without any further ado, let me introduce you to the lens of boundaries, one that's so important. The boundary lens, I think, is best described through an analogy of sports or driving. In every sporting field or on every sporting court, you're going to find lines like the ones behind me on this particular court. This particular court is actually a multi-sport use. It's basketball, it's also kind of indoor soccer and some other sports as well. Behind me, there's a road where people are driving, and if you were driving on that road, there'd be lines on that road, just like there are lines on this sport court. The lines on the road and the lines on a sport court actually create boundaries that help you to play that sport or help you drive your car safely. Now, when somebody first starts playing a sport or maybe first starts driving a car, oftentimes the player or the driver think of those lines as being quite restrictive. In fact, I remember when I first started playing basketball, I wanted to dribble the ball all over the court, inside and outside of the lines. But what I discovered is that the game is best played inside the lines. The same is true when you're driving. When you're driving, it's best and it's safest to drive inside the gutters and inside the lines. When you start to stray outside those lines while you're driving, it becomes very dangerous both for you, the other cars around you, and the people on the sides of the road. The same is true in a lot of sports. When you start to venture outside the boundary lines, it actually creates chaos and it's not enjoyable and can even be harmful to the players in the game. The same is true in relationships. When you don't look at relationships through the boundary lens, you find yourself in harm's way and especially in bad blood relationships that turn from being slightly tense to actually being toxic. Now, this is something that has been talked about for thousands of years. In fact, I want to share with you an old ancient Hebrew proverb that helps us to understand why these boundaries and this lens are so important. The book of Proverbs is an old ancient Hebrew text that shares so much wisdom that is helpful for our lives today. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 27, verse 11, there's a verse that is actually kind of gory. It's actually a little bit maybe yucky to even say or think about, but it's so powerful, the lesson that is in this proverb for what we're talking about today. It says these words, "Just like a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool repeats his folly." I know that's awful to think about, but imagine a dog going back and eating its own vomit, which, by the way, may make you think twice about whether or not you kiss your dog again. But just like a dog returns to its vomit and eats it, a fool constantly repeats his folly. He constantly repeats his mistakes. So when it comes to relationships that have bad blood in them, the reality is that we can actually become foolish by continuing to put ourselves into harm's way. So if you've already looked at the lens of possibility and you've thought about what does God think is possible for that relationship, and then you've looked at that same relationship through the lens of empathy and you've looked at it from the other person's point of view and you've had conversations with them about that, but that relationship is still marked by harm and toxicity, then you are a fool if you continue to repeat the same behaviors and put yourself in harm's way in that relationship. That's where boundaries become so important. The boundary lens allows you not to be the fool that goes back to its own vomit, repeats that over and over again, and puts themselves in harm's way. So the big question is this. The obvious question is, how do you set up healthy boundaries then? If I've looked through the lens of possibility and I've looked through the lens of empathy, but the relationship is still not healthy, in fact, it's quite toxic, how do I set healthy boundaries? That's a great question, and the Apostle Paul has something to say to us about how to do that. So the Apostle Paul was a guy that lived in the first century, wrote much of what we know as the New Testament today through letters that he wrote to first century believers who had just started following Jesus. And as we've said already, he was no stranger to bad blood in relationships. He had been the person that tried to persecute those that were early followers of Jesus. And so lots of his friends hated Christians, and he was kind of seen as a leader and somebody that was good at taking care of the problem of Christians. But then he had his own experience where he literally saw the light of Jesus and became the greatest promoter that Christianity has ever seen. So you can imagine the people that he used to persecute, there was probably bad blood in those relationships, and the people that he then used to hang out with, now he was a Christian leader, probably there was bad blood in those relationships. So he's no stranger to bad blood. He wrote in Romans these powerful words. He said this, we've looked at this already. He says, "If it's possible, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." Now I want to focus in on that middle phrase. If it's possible, we've already looked at the possibility lens. That next phrase says, as far as it depends on you. See, the reality is for a bad blood relationship to be restored and brought back to health and life, both parties have to want to do that. But we all know that not every relationship is like that. So this verse helps us to establish boundaries when it comes to relationships. He says, as far as it depends on you. So when it comes to the boundary in a toxic relationship, here's the question I want to ask you. Have you done everything that you can possibly do to restore that relationship, to make it healthy again? And if you can answer honestly, I've done everything as far as it depends on me, then you can create a boundary that says, I'm no longer putting myself in harm's way. I'm not going to be the fool that goes back to this vomit over and over again, like the Proverbs says, because I've done everything that I can possibly do, and the ball is, so to speak, in their court. That's a healthy boundary. But before you establish that boundary, you have to really be honest and say, have I done everything as far as it depends on me? Have I looked at it through the lens of empathy? Have I looked at it through the lens of possibility? What could God believe is possible for that relationship? And if I've done all of those things, I'm not going to put myself in harm's way. I'm going to create a healthy boundary that says I'm doing everything I can to live at peace with that person, but the ball is now in their court. So let's get practical. Maybe you've got a relationship where somebody is constantly asking you for more money. They need to borrow more money, or maybe they're constantly asking to stay with you and they don't take responsibility for their own life. You may be thinking, well, wait a second, Jason, doesn't the Bible say that we're supposed to carry each other's burdens? The reality is that a burden is different than a responsibility. A responsibility is something that each of us are invited and responsible to carry on our own. A burden is something that actually requires some friends to come around and help you with. So think of some things like a job, your shelter. Those types of things are each of our responsibilities. A burden might be when a catastrophic or a tragic thing happens in someone's life and they need friends to come around and help them to carry that burden. There's a difference between burdens and responsibilities. So let's get practical. When it comes to responsibilities, each of us need to carry our own responsibilities. When it comes to burdens, we're invited to help each other out and carry each other's burdens, but there is a difference. Many times in toxic relationships, people are constantly asking you to take care of a responsibility that they should take care of themselves. Not a burden, but a responsibility. So, when you've done everything in your power, as far as it depends on you, Paul would say, that's when a boundary needs to be established. So if you've answered the question, am I doing everything as far as it depends on me, then that's the time to create the boundary. And the best way to create a boundary is to learn a very simple 2-letter word, and the word is no. Now you can say no nicely, but you still need to learn how to say no when it comes to toxic relationships. And that's the best way to establish healthy boundaries. Now imagine your life, even with a toxic relationship, with the freedom and the peace knowing that you've done everything as far as it depends on you to make that relationship healthy again. But now is the time to live in freedom by saying no and creating a healthy boundary. Imagine the difference that could make in your life. Imagine the difference that could make in the other person's life as they begin to establish the responsibility of owning their life and taking responsibility for the things that they need to take responsibility for. It'll be a gift for you in your life, and eventually it becomes a gift for them in their life as well. So I want you to imagine whatever that relationship is right now, have you done everything as far as it depends on you? If the answer is yes, then the next answer may need to be no to help you establish healthy relationships in that part of your life. I want you to imagine what that will look like. And this week, here's a practical thing to do. Learn how to say that simple word no and begin creating that healthy boundary.